The issue of cloning is an issue that's been around for a few years already, but it gets more and more important as we indeed approach the prospect of actual human cloning. As all of us know, although I understand that her life is presently in danger because of the hoof and mouth disease spreading through Europe, but Dolly, the first cloned sheep, was produced a few years ago, and I believe that Dolly is already a grandmother. She already has einiglach, as it were. And it's been well established that at least theoretically, if one could clone a sheep, then one should be able to clone a human being. Although we have souls and all sorts of other things, but our physical bodies are not much more complicated than that of a complex mammal like a sheep. So certainly human cloning is well within the realm of theoretical possibility. Of course, as you know, the federal government has put a moratorium on the funding of human cloning experimentation. But that's an interesting point. I think that's worthy of a bit of attention as well. You know, in the old days, before the great biotech revolutions in genetic engineering, if the federal government didn't fund something, that basically meant it was dead. It didn't go forward. That is absolutely not the case today. There is no federal prohibition on cloning. There is simply a moratorium on federal funding, meaning private industry is perfectly legally able to go ahead and clone, except where particular states may have prohibited it. I understand California, I believe, is the only state that has prohibited cloning experimentation outright. And because of the tremendous amount of private capital that is now available in the biotech industry, certainly a federal moratorium does not at all mean the kiss of death. And in fact, one might have to ponder the following problem. If, in fact, we as a society consider cloning to be dangerous and improper, a federal moratorium may not be the best way to proceed, because a federal moratorium simply gets the government out of it totally, leaves it to unregulated private industry. Perhaps it would be much better to have some responsible oversight and regulation rather than totally leave it to the free market. So, in a way, dealing with a serious ethical problem through a mechanism of a funding moratorium is really analogous to the ostrich sticking its head in the ground to escape dealing with a problem. A problem does not go away because you fail to acknowledge its existence. As I say, at one time, 20 or so years ago, that may have been true because if the government wasn't funding it, it didn't get done. That is absolutely not the case today. First, just to be sure that everyone understands the basic situation, what do we mean by cloning? Again, I'm a little embarrassed if there are scientists in the room. My description will undoubtedly be oversimplistic, but I will just give you a very, very tiny, brief, layperson's understanding of what cloning is. We know that, generally speaking, human and animal reproduction takes place by a union of egg and sperm, each of which contains half of the genetic component of a human being or an animal. Every born animal or human being has 50% of its genetic contribution from the sperm, 50% from the egg. The chromosomes match, and therefore you have a genetically distinct individual. What is amazing about really every type of human or animal organism is that the entire genetic blueprint of the organism is contained in any given cell within the organism. So for example, if you take a skin cell, or you take a hair cell, or you take a cell of a big toe, or a brain cell, or a kidney cell, within that cell there is the DNA that could create hearts, livers, legs, arms, whatever it might be. And indeed, when sperm initially fertilizes an egg and the cells begin to divide at a very early stage, they are undifferentiated. In other words, they turn into differentiated cells only at a later stage of development, cell differentiation, where certain cells turn into eye cells, liver cells, heart cells, whatever it might be. Now, this mechanism of the on and off switching is very, very mysterious. Like, what tells the eye cell that it's supposed to be an eye cell? Why doesn't it become a heart cell or a liver cell? Because after all, the DNA encoding is still there. In theory, if one were to master the mechanisms of the on and off switching, you could construct an entire organism from any given cell And indeed, you can construct any particular organ, in theory, from any given cell. You could make a heart from a skin cell. You could make an eye from a liver. Because basically, the entire DNA is within every single cell, except in the course of cell differentiation, the DNA for liver, whatever it is, gets shut off when it becomes an eye or whatever it is. Cloning, essentially, is a process that manages, within limited confines, to reverse the cell differentiation. And the way it would work, again, the simple cloning, let's take the Dolly cloning, which is perhaps the simplest type of cloning that exists, is that you take an egg, which contains a nucleus, you strip away the nucleus of that egg, and instead of inserting sperm or the like, you insert an already differentiated cell. In Dolly's case, it was a mammary cell, and you somehow activate that cell and the egg so that it begins to split and regress back into its undifferentiated state, in which you have cell splitting, and eventually it turns into an entire organism. In other words, what the egg does is, the egg is the medium that enables the already differentiated cell to turn back into an embryo, in a sense, in its undifferentiated state. So cloning essentially has three characteristics, which are really all interrelated. Number one, it is asexual reproduction, meaning it is reproduction without the union of egg and sperm. Number two, it is a reversal of the cell differentiation process. So you're taking an already differentiated cell, and you're, through the egg and the electric jolt and the nutrients and everything else, you're managing to regress it back into its pre-differentiated state, so it then becomes a complete organism. And number three, because all of the DNA comes from a single source, the egg has been stripped of its nucleus. The egg is simply the medium for splitting, but all of the DNA, except the mitochondrial DNA, but all of the nucleic DNA is coming from a single source. You have, in theory, an exact genetic copy of the DNA source. Now, if you think about it, of course, identical twins are even closer than clones, because identical twins share not only an identical nucleic DNA, but they also share, because they're born from the same mother, they have that same mitochondrial DNA. That's not true in the case of a clone, because although the primary genetic material was taken from a single source, it is then inserted in the nucleus of an egg, which has its mitochondrial DNA. So there would actually be a clone is actually not as closely related to the clone source as would be identical twins. So these are the three basic characteristics of a cloning situation. It's asexual reproduction, it is a reversal of cell differentiation, and it's DNA from a single source primarily that results, so it is thought, in fundamentally a genetic copy of that single source. Well, one question you might ask before we even get into the Jewish perspectives is, why bother? In other words, what's wrong with the old-fashioned way of reproduction? Why go through the trouble of cloning? Well, for example, with respect to animals, cloning might have potentially a lot of industrial uses. Let us assume, for example, on a very simple level, that a given cow is a champion milk producer, or a given sheep is a good wool producer, and the like. If you could make exact genetic copies, you would be able to have that in your entire herd, instead of diluting a superior strain by crossbreeding with something else. So, in effect, you're getting carbon copies of the milk and wool producers. However, what's interesting is the real value of cloning in the animal area, again, my primary talk is about human, is when you combine cloning with genetic engineering. And this is the thing. Because now, for example, animals can be genetically engineered with human DNA or other types of DNA so that they produce certain drugs or certain medications that would be beneficial for the treatment of disease. Now, if all you had was the genetic engineering technology without the cloning technology, you would have to laboriously genetically engineer, 1 million embryos. Every single one you want, you're going to have to fool around with. Now, theoretically, that is possible. But cloning creates a tremendous shortcut. That, you genetically engineer one, and then you can simply make clones by taking a cell from that and propagating. So the real payoff in animal cloning will be when you combine genetic engineering together with the ability to clone, because then you're essentially, so the belief is, you're essentially Xerox, I shouldn't use Xerox, it's a trademark, but you're essentially copying, as it were, the particular alteration which can produce the drugs or the medicines or whatever it is. In other words, you get your drug factories without having to go through the process of building a separate drug factory by manipulating every animal. So cloning on the animal level has certain benefits. There is even sentimental cloning. Some fellow in California, I read recently, left, I believe, $3.5 million to clone his dead dog, because, as you know, cloning can actually, to a certain degree, can even last after death if some of the DNA may survive, even if the organism as a whole has died. And that's a pretty large contribution, $3.5 million to clone Missy, I believe her name was. I'm sorry, I see here that this is called the Missy-plicity Project at Texas A&M, are using the $2.3 million offered them by a bereft pet owner to try to copy his dead dog, Missy. So, once again, totally legal. So, in the animal field, there are certainly benefits. What about the human field? Well, first of all, the very last example points out a potential use, which some would consider very good and some would consider a little scary, and that is to clone, for example, a child that is dying, or to some degree even after the child is dead. But certainly, let's imagine someone has the tragedy of facing a dying child. Theoretically, one could create, now of course it's not the same person, and I will address that, but one could create at least a genetic copy through a cloning process. But here again, just to be sure people understand the picture, people sometimes have an erroneous understanding, again, just in terms of popular press, of cloning, where you think that you clone someone, and as you walk into the clone shop, dressed in your three-piece suit or whatever it is, and two of you walk out, like I think it was a Michael Keaton movie. That's not going to work. Even when we clone a human being, and it probably will happen in the next few years, you don't clone somebody who's exactly your age. I mean, essentially, you've created an embryo. If that embryo is then transferred to a woman's uterus, and 9 months later you give birth to a baby, so essentially, at best, the clone would be similar to a twin that is X number of years younger than you. In other words, if you're 40 years old, when you clone yourself, your clone will be 40 years younger than you. It'll be a newborn baby. Now, okay, I guess in the case of dogs, that's not a big deal because, dogs will catch up in a few years. But on the other hand, if you want to clone, let's say, a 25-year-old child, it'll be, 25 years until that child will be exactly the same, even physically, as the child in front of you. So again, we do have to remember that cloning does not mean, you get the exact thing right away. It goes through a gestational process and the like. But once again, cloning has been suggested as a way of perpetuating on some level the life of a child that is dying or perhaps even dead. Cloning has also been suggested as a way of dealing with infertility. Rabbi Tendler, who gave testimony in front of a congressional committee on this issue, gives the following hypothetical. Of course, you're going to find many other cases as well. Let's imagine you have a Holocaust survivor, a male Holocaust survivor, who is the last survivor of his family, all of whom have been wiped out in the Holocaust. He is married, but he is unable to have a child because either he doesn't have sperm, or, to add a little twist on it, perhaps he was castrated in a concentration camp. He is unable to produce sperm. His wife might be fully able both to ovulate and carry a pregnancy, but he has no sperm. Now, one can understand an understandable desire not to be the end of the line, to be able to perpetuate their family. Adoption is certainly an option, and Halacha would certainly consider adoption to be an appropriate response. But nevertheless, one also understands that there might be a desire for some type of biological continuity. Well, in the absence of sperm, generally speaking, male reproduction would be impossible. But through cloning, that is no longer the case, because you can now take a cell from any part of his body, hair, fingernail, whatever it is, take out the nucleus of the egg of his wife, and through an in vitro procedure, insert his DNA into her egg, jolt it with the appropriate electric shock or whatever it is, and then transplant it to her uterus. Now, when that child is born, granted, the DNA, the characteristics will be totally, primarily those of the husband, but the wife, number one, does have the maternal bond of giving birth to a child. There's mitochondrial DNA, and there's the hormonal environment of pregnancy. The point is, it is not the same, absolutely, as a biological child of both parents, but on the other hand, both father and mother have a closer biological tie than they would have in adoption. So if the alternative is adoption, and there's a desire to approach a biological child as closely as possible, cloning could offer real hope for a male infertility. So either replacing a dead or dying child, if that's the appropriate word, male infertility. There are other potential uses in which one might clone to obtain compatible bone marrow or the like. You may recall around, I think it was over 10 years ago, there was a young adolescent in Texas who had leukemia, and she needed a bone marrow transplant. And her parents were not compatible donors, and there was no one in the registry that was compatible. And her parents decided on the off chance to try to conceive and have a child so that the child might be a compatible match for her older sibling. And indeed, it was kind of a miracle. The parents, there's so many variables here. The parents did conceive a child, and lo and behold, this baby was indeed a perfect donor match for her older sibling. At the time, I remember that there was a lot of ethical discussion in the press about the ethics of conceiving a child to use as a bone marrow transplant for a sibling. Again, I find the ethical concerns a little unfair in a society that legitimates abortion. If they would have decided to abort for any reason whatsoever, that does not raise any ethical issue as far as the law is concerned. So one wonders why conceiving a child that is loved and taken care of, but is also used to save the life of a sibling, is fundamentally more unethical than would be the abortion itself. But again, sometimes I think that people are missing a larger picture in focusing on ethical problems that get attention in the press. But be it as it may, it is clear that if cloning technology would have been available, they could have greatly, of course it worked out anyway, thank God, but they could have greatly increased the possibilities of success, because with cloning, if you actually clone from the patient, and you get, of course you still have to get a pregnancy, a fertilization and the like, you will get a genetically identical bone marrow which will not be rejected. Of course, there's a certain catch-22 here which needs to be explored, and that is, to the extent that so many cancers are genetically linked. So here's the problem. If you clone marrow from someone who has developed leukemia, are you simply replicating the same defective mutations that gave rise to the cancer in the first place? In other words, are you really necessarily doing something good, or are you simply reincorporating not the disease, but at least the disease potential back into the body? That's a bit of a tricky question, and I don't have all the data on that. But suffice it to say that at a minimum you might buy time, meaning to say by cloning you may have fresh, as it were, DNA, which takes X number of years to produce the mutation. So perhaps you're buying time. And also, in light of the fact that the genetic bases of cancer are often interactive with environmental risk factors. So it's possible that when you create the new cloned marrow, perhaps the environmental toxins and the like might be avoided or minimized. So it is thought that perhaps cloning might be a way to obtain compatible marrow that the body will not reject. So those we might call the potentially beneficial uses of cloning. Now, if we talk about the negative uses of cloning, we can certainly come up with nightmare scenarios. People talk about having spare clones of myself for organs like hearts or livers, meaning I keep, like Charlie McCarthy in the closet. So when I need a heart, I just cut out that heart. Again, these are kind of the nightmare scenarios that are often spun. And I think, although we'll have to prove it a little later on, but I think most of us intuitively feel that to cut into a clone, to take out a heart, resulting in the death of that clone, I think intuitively most people regard that as murder, although I'll try to justify that a little later on. So clearly that type of stuff, like cutting into the heart or taking out a liver from a clone, that would be regarded as totally improper. By the way, just to digress a second about this case about the use of the bone marrow of a newborn infant in order to save the life of an older sibling, and this was done. It's interesting, there had been a case in Israel 20 years ago which involved a minor child who was a compatible kidney donor. His older brother had a renal failure and needed a kidney transplant. And of course, kidneys, as you know, because we have two of them, you can take one kidney from a live donor. And the question was whether the minor sibling could donate a kidney to the older sibling. Now, he wanted to. He wasn't forced, but he wanted to. So the psak halacha, this actually went as a question in halacha, was that even though an adult can consent to a live donation, even though it puts him at some risk, a child does not have the competency to put himself at risk by consenting to an organ donation. And not only that, but even the parents do not have the right to make that decision for a child, because the parental right to make decisions for the medical care of a child pertain to what is in the best interest of the child. A parent does not have the halachic right to consent to put one child at risk in order to save another child. So the psak halacha actually was, and it seems harsh on some level, that until this child reaches the age of majority, which in Judaism is not that old, it's bar or bas mitzvah, but until the child reaches the age of majority, he will not be allowed to donate an organ. And I understand that that story had a very sad ending, and as a result, the older sibling, unfortunately, actually passed away. Now, the question is sometimes raised, well, gee, what would halacha say about the bone marrow transplant? Because there also, you took from a minor, a newborn baby, without the baby's consent. But again, it seems that the poskim do differentiate between the two situations in their belief that removal of a kidney, even though you could survive with one kidney, is more of an at-risk procedure because it creates certain future dangers regarding kidney failure and the need for dialysis, and therefore the concept is, I cannot endanger my child in order to save another child's life, as opposed to the bone marrow transplant, which was not fundamentally a dangerous procedure for the newborn, although there was a certain amount of pain that undoubtedly was involved. So the two situations are different. But the point is, so far where we're at is, we've tried to identify some good uses of cloning, some bad uses of cloning. What does Jewish law say about cloning? So first, I want to make a preliminary remark that's very, very important in terms of an overall philosophy. You sometimes hear the refrain that certain technologies are wrong because we are not supposed to play God. That God, does these things. We are not supposed to play God, and therefore we condemn certain interventions because they are playing God, right? That's a common phrase. In fact, that's the name of the talk tonight. I would like to suggest in somewhat of an irreverent way that not only is it not wrong to play God in certain ways, but in fact, God commands us to play God. And that is to say that Judaism does not believe that we are to be left to the blind operation of the forces of nature. Rather, we are told that man is made in the image of God. And that has many, many meanings. It refers to the divine soul. It refers to morality. But Rav Soloveitchik, for example, writes that the concept of Tselem Elokim, being made in the image of God, gives man a warrant not to be quiescent or passive in the face of nature, but to conquer disease, to utilize technology, to be able to create new things as God creates new things. Meaning to say, the concept of man and God is that man exists in a collaborative partnership with God to bring goodness in the world, in the sense of moral goodness, and to create technology and science, which also has a religious dimension. The exploration of science, Rav Soloveitchik writes very eloquently, is actually a form of religious expression. That's not to say every scientist believes in God and is religious. But the point is, the exploration of science can be regarded as a holy venture, as it were, to bring a sense of godliness, renewal, creativity into the world. Thus, for example, Christian scientists have the theological position that if God created illness, only God can alleviate that illness, and they don't believe in going to physicians. They only believe in spiritual healing. And in fact, in the law books, we have many instances of Christian Science parents being subjected to criminal prosecution for failure to provide medical treatment to their children. These are not abusive parents. These are perfectly fine parents, except for this particular issue, but they don't believe in taking their kid to a doctor when he has a ruptured appendix. If the child dies, these parents will be prosecuted for usually manslaughter or the like. Now, Judaism does not believe that at all. In the book of Exodus, we read, "V'rapo yirapeh," if somebody is injured, I have to pay his medical bills. And the Gemara in Bava Kama remarks, from here we learn that the doctor is given permission to practice medicine. Why do you need a pasuk to say a doctor has permission to practice medicine? Rashi says, I'm paraphrasing, I might have thought like a Christian scientist. Rashi doesn't say that exactly, but Rashi says, I might have thought, if God makes you sick, only God can heal you. What gives a human being the right to interfere with the will of God? That's what I would have thought. But what does the Torah say? Go to the doctor. And the reason is because we do not posit that there's a dichotomy between God and man in that sense, but rather the wisdom and creativity of man, when I say man, of course, I include human beings, men and women, is in itself a gift from God. If it was God's will that Jonas Salk or Albert Sabin should discover a way to treat polio in the 1950s, then it was God's will that that should be used. Now, why didn't God allow that to happen earlier? We don't know. But certainly, we do not regard human creativity as contravening the divine will, but we regard human creativity as part and parcel of what God wants human beings to do. So the concept that a given technology is per se off limits because it's not natural, because it's changing the way God made the world, is a very static view of how God regards the role, how Judaism regards the role of a human being as being a collaborator with God. So the point is, you cannot end this debate by simply bringing up a pious statement, we cannot play God. One has to flesh it out a little bit more, recognizing that all technologies have good purposes and bad purposes. There is a potential for the betterment of society, and there's the potential for evil in the world. And a society has to make a judgment based on moral principles, whether the good outweighs the evil or the evil outweighs the good. Certainly, Judaism would not endorse whatever you can do, you should do. Certainly, we recognize that there have to be breaks, but we impose the breaks not by virtue of a philosophical issue, you can't interfere with nature, but we impose the breaks by virtue of the evils that a given technology might lead to, which requires responsible debate and requires identifying those evils to the extent that we can, which is why, as I suggested before, the federal moratorium approach is not necessarily a productive way to deal with the cloning issue, because the federal moratorium approach closes off debate of the issue rather than regulating it and discussing what the good points and the bad points are. So that's one point. It's very, very important that we keep in mind. You know, the famous joke that people always say about the believer in God who was caught in a flash flood, and he was on the roof of his house, and the boats came by to save him, and he said no, and the helicopter came by to save him, and he said no, and the airplane came by to save him, and he said no, and he keeps on turning down every bit of help because he says, God will take care of me. And when he finally drowns, and in his final conscious thoughts, he thinks in his mind, God, why have you abandoned me? God said, who do you think sent you? The boat and the rope ladder. That's how God helps us. And Maimonides, who was a great doctor, writes, he who turns down medical treatments because they believe God will heal him is like a person who refuses to eat because he says God will feed him. Yes, God feeds us, but God requires that we put the food in our mouths, otherwise it's not going to go in. Now, that's not to say you're not going to find minority positions on this. For example, there's a passage in the Talmud that talks about Chizkiyahu HaMelech, a righteous king, and it mentions that one of the good things that Chizkiyahu did was he concealed the Book of Cures. He put it away. What is the Book of Cures? The Book of Cures was an ancient physician's desk reference that listed all the medications of the time and what they were good for. He withdrew it from circulation, and that's a good thing. Now listen to this. Why was that a good thing? So listen to these two explanations. Rashi says, the famous Rashi says, it was a good thing because people were relying too much on medicine and not prayer. So he withdrew medical knowledge from circulation so that people would turn to God rather than physicians. From Rashi, there's a little bit of an intimation that spiritual healing is the optimal avenue to pursue. But listen to Maimonides. Maimonides, as you would expect, rejects that interpretation. And Maimonides says, you know why he withdrew the Book of Healing? Because lay people were reading it on their own without going to doctors. He withdrew the book from circulation so people would go to doctors. Well, we'll call that the pro-AMA position. So it just shows you, interestingly enough, that the identical passage of the Talmud can be susceptible to two radically opposite interpretations, whether basically should one seek spiritual healing to the exclusion of medical therapy, or should one seek therapy from professionals. Now again, obviously spirituality is essential. God is the source. God is the source of all healing, but it needs to be augmented with natural ways. Okay, so having said this, the issue now before us is not whether you're playing God. That's okay, as long as you know you're the junior partner. It is okay to utilize new creative. In fact, I just want to mention, again, things come to me as I'm talking, that, you know, this is to be contrasted not only with Christian Science, but even with the Catholic Church. Most of us know the Catholic Church's traditional opposition to birth control and abortion. That's well known, and to some degree, that overlaps with Jewish law. But what is much less known is that the Catholic Church is against reproductive technologies such as in vitro fertilization. I am not talking about exotic in vitro where you have egg donation and surrogate motherhood. I'm talking about husband's sperm and wife's egg. And Pope John Paul has said that in vitro fertilization is wrong because it is not the natural way of producing a child. Now, that's not to say halakha does not have issues with in vitro fertilization. That's a talk for another time. But you will not find the condemnation of something because it's not natural. The halachic approach is, if naturally one cannot produce a result, one is permitted to try to produce the result unnaturally. Human wisdom is part of God's mandate to man. Okay, so now the issue therefore becomes not, is it wrong to play God? But the issue is to try to identify the specific problems a technology gives rise to and whether the problems are greater than the benefits. So I'd like to divide this into two parts. The first part, I want to sketch out some general ethical problems that cloning technology has. And these are not specifically Jewish ethical issues, although Judaism obviously is going to be concerned with all of these. And then the second half is I want to go over some specifically Jewish concerns. So my first group of concerns, I would be willing to say it in front of Congress. The second group of concerns, Congress would not be too interested in, but it's something that concerned Jews and rabbis do have to be worried about. So let's deal first with some general concerns. And that is, concern number one, if cloning ever becomes a widespread possibility, the first question, which is the true for any technology, is who gets to decide who uses it? What are going to be the criteria for this technology? Because we do know that HMOs are not going to be paying for cloning in the near future. In fact, HMOs are much more interested in physician-assisted suicide than cloning. They don't want to double you. They want to have you instead. So the HMOs are not going to be in that particular line of business. This is going to be a very, very expensive issue. And we know in our society, healthcare decisions, or the allocation of healthcare resources, which is somewhat of an issue I'll be discussing next month, can only be allocated in two ways. One way is market economy, meaning if you're rich, you'll get it, and if you're poor, you won't get it. And I think most of us would be poor under that definition in terms of what it's going to cost. Or the alternative is some type of government rationing or allocation process. Now let's consider the implications of each of those. Let's assume that cloning technology would be allocated on a market basis, on the basis of if you can afford it, you get it. Well, that could seriously skew the quality of human being that we have on the planet, because cloning decisions would be made not necessarily based on what would be good for society as a whole, but it would be based on private profit or gain, which of course could backfire. Let's assume, for example, that I own the Chicago Bulls and Michael Jordan announced his retirement. I may decide, of course it's a question of who makes that decision. This will be a whole other issue, who has cloning rights over athletic players or whatever it is. I may decide I'd like to clone 10 Michael Jordans, and I'll wait 15 or 20 years, and then I'll have these 10 or 100 Michael Jordans out there. Of course, keep in mind that severely dilutes the value of the franchise, because Michael Jordan was valuable because he was one. I mean, if you had 150 Michael Jordans in the NBA, that would be the average player. That wouldn't mean very much. But be it as it may, one could imagine that decisions will be made based on short-term profit, which may turn out to be illusory anyway, because who says a clone of Michael Jordan would even want to play basketball? That's a separate issue I'll get to. But even if we make those assumptions, you're not necessarily going to have a net benefit for society. Moreover, if we talk about market allocation, once again, you have factors such as egomaniac involved. Saddam Hussein might decide to clone 10 of himself or whatever it is. Now, if we go to government allocation, our situation is even worse. Even if we assume good faith and competence, which is a very heavy assumption to make, even if we make that assumption, by what conceivable criterion can the government decide how to allocate cloning technology? We need lawyers, so let's clone lawyers. I mean, you don't clone a profession, so to speak. And besides, it is really impossible for society to predict what their needs truly are over a long period of time. Imagine, if you remember Mark Twain's novel, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. Well, let's imagine that in King Arthur's courts, there was cloning technology available. And they had to make a decision, what types of people are best suited for the needs of 13th century society and the next few hundred years? Well, they would clone people with strong backs and broad shoulders who are able to carry a lot of stones. I mean, but that would totally upset, as it were, the future course of history. We should also say, too, that certainly when you get into government allocation and decisions would be made as to which people are more clonable than others, we as Jews who have been victimized in the 20th century with the tragedies of the Holocaust, in which some people were considered more human than others, some genotypes were more worthy of replication than others, we have to be very, very wary of any type of system that would determine preferences for a certain type of genetic replications over others. Because any philosophy that says some human beings are more worthy of copying than other human beings, whether it's a question of blonde hair, blue eyes, or whether it's a question of 6 foot 6 inches, or whether it's a question of IQ, there's a certain stigmatization and demeaning of life that I'm not saying that cloning will lead to genocide, but it is certainly on the path that can lead to a philosophy that would support things like genocide and the like. So there's some alarming factors to keep in mind. But let me raise the second issue. So that's the issue of who decides. But the second issue is a very simple issue, but a very disturbing one, and that is the issue of quality control. Now, the word quality control itself is very disturbing because that sounds like, you have an assembly line for cars and everything else. But we have to face this. The cloning technology, in order to produce a dolly, there were more than 200 attempts that were made. One can recognize that although the learning curve may decline later, but at least initially, there's going to be a lot of failures. Now, this is true for any reproductive technology. In vitro itself had a lot of failures. But here is the disturbing data that we already have. Most of the failures in the in vitro process simply resulted in the egg not being fertilized. So you had a sperm and an egg that didn't fertilize. Some of the failures that we see in animal cloning involve serious genetic mutations, involve abortions in late term, involve births with grossly deformed organs. In other words, you're not simply dealing with, the sperm that fails to fertilize the egg. You're dealing with mutations and serious defects. Now, granted, in the course of time, there'll be improvements and adjustments that may make this a declining problem. But who's going to pay that cost until those matters are going to be resolved? Is it ethical to embark on reproductive technologies that create very, very high risks of deformities, of defects, of pain and suffering, of various types of mutations which cannot yet be predicted with any accuracy? Now, as I say, given the realities of the world, and people will go ahead with this, so I suppose in a few years the korbanos, the sacrifices, will have taken place, and maybe in 20 or 30 years it'll be smooth sailing. But as a society, one has to severely question whether the ethics of putting people at risk in the short term justify embarking on this. And as I say, the preliminary data in animal cloning has already indicated that all sorts of things go wrong. Let me just read you a paragraph in terms of animal cloning. Cloned cattle and sheep are often born dangerously large. Normally, you might expect a 100-pound birth weight in a calf. With a clone, you might get 160 pounds. Again, the reasons are not entirely clear. Such outsized calves don't have room to wriggle around in the uterus. They are born lame or with limb deformities. The kidneys are not right. They're put together wrong. The heart is, the lungs, the immune system. It can be a unique abnormality. They can die within a few days after birth, or sometimes they just can't make it after you cut the umbilical cord. Nobody really knows why. So this issue of quality control is an issue that one has to be honest and one has to face. And once again, one wonders whether the women who are volunteers in these cloning experimentations are really aware of what the risks and the dangers are. So that's really a second issue that needs to be considered. As I say, it is a very serious issue, but it may decline with the passage of time. The third issue I want to raise may sound trivial, but I think it's major, and that is the psychological problem of being a clone. All of us who are parents, and all of us who have parents, know that the great difficulty in the parent-child relationship is parents often try to live their dreams through their children. If dad was a quarterback at the University of Michigan football team, but then had a bum knee, he's going to push his son, and maybe his daughter, to go out for football. We live our dreams through our children without always appreciating that our children have different personalities, different interests, and may want to pursue a different dream. Well, if my kid has that pressure, even though he's only 50% from me, what happens if my son is a clone of me? When I see my son, I'm, let's say, 55, and I see my son when he's 20, he is the University of Michigan quarterback that I wanted to be. Now, indeed, therefore, one could say, people think if you clone Albert Einstein, He will be a physicist. Well, maybe not. Maybe Albert Einstein's clone will want to play basketball. Maybe Michael Jordan's clone will be interested in physics. The point is this. A clone may be genetically identical, but nevertheless, there is a unique and distinct personality. And we do not believe, certainly Judaism does not believe, that biology is destiny. In fact, there's a beautiful passage in the Talmud. We've completed the Human Genome Project, or at least a major stage of it. And the question is raised, people raise a philosophical question about the Human Genome Project. When we go further and we map and we sequence genes, the question is going to be, we're going to find that even many emotional behaviors have genetic bases. We might find the anger gene, the disorganization gene. In the 1980s, the big defenses in California were food-related. There was the Twinkies defense, or there was the premenstrual PMS defense. But now, the Human Genome Project offers all sorts of defenses. I have the murder gene. I have the rage gene. I have the anger gene, the disorganization gene, whatever it might be. And the philosophical question is raised whether the Human Genome Project effectively destroys human responsibility and free will by basically attributing everything to the biochemical composition of the human cellular structure. Well, our answer is the following. Let me quote to you a Gemara in Tractate Shabbat. Our Chachamim, our sages, did not know of, or did not speak of, DNA. That was not the technology that was known. But they spoke instead of mazel, that you're born under a certain constellation, and that hardwires your personality in some way. Now, we can look at that and laugh and say, oh, astrology, how primitive. But there's a much larger point here. The point is not that Chazal talked about astrology and we talk about DNA. The point is Chazal have identified that within a human personality, there's a certain deterministic component. There's something you're born with. There's something you're hardwired with. They called it astrology. We call it DNA. It's the same principle. So Chazal say the following. If you are born under the constellation of the planet Mars, you will be a shedder of blood. You will love blood. There is nothing you can do to overcome your desire for bloodshed. You don't have a chance. But you can decide to be a shochet, a slaughterer of animals, or a mohel, a ritual circumciser, or a murderer. In other words, the insight here is a very strong insight, and that is, we are not totally free agents. There are aspects of our personality that are hardwired and more or less immutable. But within that immutability, there is a range of choice that we can make in the positive sense or the negative sense. Call that the X factor. Call it manual override. Call it free will. Call it soul. There are many spiritual terms that you can use. And this, I would suggest, is exactly the answer to how to approach the Human Genome Project. And that is to say, yes, there are propensities, there are tendencies, there are genetic predispositions to certain types of behaviors. But the human being has the capacity of override, choice, sublimation, direction, and therefore we do not regard genetic predisposition as in any way destroying the concept of free will and accountability. And essentially that deals, the same issue is true for the clone. The clone may be biologically identical, 90% or so, to their father, or to the clone donor, I should say, but nevertheless, he has a separate soul, a separate desire, a separate interest, and the psychological problems, however, might be fairly considerable. So I think we have to pay attention to the psychological burden of being a clone, right? It's hard enough to be an adolescent. If you're a teenage clone, sounds like a movie, I was a teenage clone, the problems are going to be greatly magnified. Concern number 4. Cloning technology is a further incursion in the separation of a loving relationship from the creation of life. By that I mean, the Gemara gives us a description of how life should be created by stating there are 3 partners in a human being: father, mother, and God. Father and mother come together, and God throws in the component of the soul. Now, the truth of the matter is, this paradigm of loving relationship of father, mother, child is already been thrown into great disarray. Consider, for example, the single woman who gets impregnated from an anonymous sperm bank. Hardly loving relationship there. I mean, she doesn't even know who the donor is. But cloning takes us one step further. Cloning renders males totally useless, or at least unnecessary in the world. The women are still needed. Men are totally not needed. Cloning allows a woman to have a child all by herself. Let me explain how this would be so. Her egg is extracted. The nucleus of her egg is stripped away. It is replaced with DNA from her in vitro. And then, when it begins splitting, it's transferred back to her uterus. She has a child without the benefit of any male factor whatsoever. Or in the alternative, in fact, the lesbian lobby are actually very, very much in favor. The lesbian lobby has accused Congress of being anti-gay in the cloning moratorium because they claim that cloning would allow gay and lesbian couples to be able to, well, not a male gay, but a lesbian couple to be able to reproduce without a male factor involved whatsoever. Now, once again, when you talk about somebody being able to have a child by themselves without even the semblance of the relationship of being injected with somebody's sperm, which by itself is very, very attenuated as a relationship element, one wonders whether there's some spiritual problem here. Because if Father, Mother, God, what happens when there's no Father, Mother? Do we know that God is in the picture, and to what degree is God in the picture? We have to generally be very, very worried about technologies that separate the creation of life from the existence of a loving man-woman relationship. And although not all cases of cloning would have to be that way, I gave the case of the Holocaust survivor and the like, but some cases of cloning could be that way, and you really couldn't necessarily limit the technology. Just a few more concerns, and then I'll go to my second half, which will be shorter. That is the arrogance of eternal life. We know that in the Bible, the concept of living too long can sometimes give a person a sense of superiority and godliness. We are told that Hiram, the king of Phoenicia, who had helped King Solomon build the temple, was given the blessing of extraordinary life, and he lived hundreds and hundreds of years, according to rabbinic tradition. And eventually, as he saw all of his contemporaries dying around him, like Dorian Gray, he began to think he was God. I mean, I guess he became God somehow. And cloning, of course, is not keeping yourself alive, technically as another person, but this notion that I could perpetuate myself indefinitely into the future does create the sense of the arrogance of self-perpetuation. According to our rabbinic teachings, actually it's in the Bible itself, remembering the day of death, as somber as that is a way of keeping us humble and submissive to the will of God. And that could be defeated by the arrogance of this indefinite self-perpetuation that cloning may involve. Finally, cloning does create or does disregard the blessings of genetic diversity. Let's even take animal cloning. You clone an identical herd in order to have certain characteristics. We don't realize that the genetic diversity through this unique combination of egg and sperm is a great bulwark against diseases that could otherwise ravage total populations, because something that'll kill one person or one animal will not have that same effect on someone else because the genetic makeup is a little different. When you start creating large quantities of genetic identities, then you're creating risks that something that attacks one can wipe everybody out. And in a sense, the old saying, don't play with Mother Nature. Again, in a sense, this does bring me back to an idea that I said we don't follow. I said we don't say don't play God as a general statement, but in certain issues of disrupting environmental balance and disrupting natural genetic diversities, there is an issue about, certain matters might be so complicated that perhaps we ought to leave things alone. If you remember Jurassic Park, you can see a very good example. Simple dinosaur, your everyday dinosaur cloning, nothing particularly difficult, actually, based on what we know now. But if you remember, there's all sorts of unforeseen effects that happen when you start disturbing the natural genetic diversity of the universe. It's a very, very excellent novel that illustrates it in a very extreme way, but at least it shows you things can go wrong, and Murphy's Law does apply in cloning as it does in much of life. So these are some general ethical concerns that we need to be concerned about. Does this mean that we should ban cloning? Not necessarily. As I say, there may be many, many areas in which it is proper, but at the same time, it has many dangers. And the question always becomes, can you limit a potentially good technology to the good cases and not allow it to go to the bad cases? That's a very hard question. Pandora's box. Once you open the box, it comes out. However, it might be suggested that perhaps some intensive regulation might be able to contain and regulate it and limit it to appropriate channels. Now, let me just mention for a few minutes some of the technical halachic issues, which, as I say, Congress is not interested in, but as a rabbi, I have to be interested in, because one day, one of my congregants, one day, someone's going to ask about what is the status of my clone. Now, here is the question. There are really, what is the status of a clone? There are three possibilities. Is a clone a human being at all? I've been assuming a clone is a human being, but now I want to defend that a little bit. There is a discussion in the Talmud of artificial life being created through Sefer Yetzirah. Sefer Yetzirah is a Kabbalistic work which tells you how to create the life. In fact, the Gemara through various formulas. In fact, you can get an English translation of Sefer Yetzirah in any Jewish bookstore. It's not going to make a lot of sense. It's Kabbalistic formulas that we don't even know how to apply them properly. But the Gemara gives us the story of how rabbis every Friday afternoon would construct a calf from the dirt, and it would become a live animal, which they would slaughter and eat in honor of the Shabbat. So you can create a life out of Sefer Yetzirah. We have in Jewish legend about the golem, which is an artificial person-like creature. Right? The Maharal of Prague in the 1500s had a golem that was kind of a giant superhero robot who would defend the Jews of Prague against anti-Semitic blood libels and the like. According to tradition, in the attic of the Maharal synagogue in Prague, which is locked, kept under lock and key, the golem is still there dormant, waiting to be revived appropriately. So there is a discussion in Halakha, does a golem count for a minyan? Let's say we have 10 people. It's discussed. Can you count a golem for a minyan? So they want to bring kind of funny proofs, because the Gemara discusses that a certain rabbi once had a slave, and he freed his slave to make a minyan. So they ask, why did he have to free his slave? He should have made a golem and kept the slave, right? So it's a proof that, a golem doesn't count. But some want to say that a golem is not human, therefore a clone is not human, because he's not created by sexual processes. In other words, some have tried to use the golem analogy to dehumanize the clone, which of course would actually allow you to cut into the clone and take out his heart. It wouldn't be murder. However, I think it's fairly clear that that is a poor analogy. The golem is not a clone. A clone is much more human simply because a clone is born from a human mother. Remember this. A golem is simply something you make out of the dirt. A clone is a yelud isha, and that's very important. A clone is born from a human mother. Now, if we ever develop an artificial incubator, which we have not yet for 9 months, there'll be some very serious questions whether even if it's an in vitro, whether such a child is Jewish, because being born from the uterus is an extremely important criterion of human identity. But suffice it to say, if we don't have that artificial incubator yet, and it's just a clone who is born from a human mother, it's a davar pashut. It is obvious, I would think, the clone is human, and we don't apply the golem analogy. Okay, but let's go further. Okay, a clone is human. But is a clone a distinct human being? Or is a clone just me? If I walk in with my clone and there are 8 people in synagogue, do we have 9 people or 10 people? Again, this appears to be obvious. If identical twins count as 2, and I assume they do, then since my relationship to a clone is even less exact than identical twins, not only is a clone human, but he's a separate human. I think that's a safe assumption. But question 3, I think, is problematical. If I clone myself, is my clone my son, or is my clone my brother? Because if you think about it, right, a cell from my fingernail is taken, inserted in my wife's egg, and she gives birth to a kid 9 months later. If you think about it, since my clone is fundamentally a genetic copy of me, maybe my parents are the father and mother of that clone. In other words, you might look at a clone as a virtual identical twin that is born X number of years after his other identical twin. Meaning to say, the true relationship of a clonor and a clonee, if that's the appropriate term, is not that of parent and child, but that of brothers, and therefore the clone's grandparents are actually his parents, in a sense. Now, let me give you some differences, why this is important. I mean, it's important intrinsically. But let's take, for example, there's a mitzvah in the Torah called Yibum. Yibum is levirate marriage. That means if a man dies without children, there's a mitzvah upon his brother to marry the widow to perpetuate the seed of the brother who died. Right? That's called Yibum. Consider this hypothetical. A man dies, and the only child he has left is a clone of himself. Now, if the clone is deemed his son, he died with a son. If he died with a son, there's no commandment of Yibum, and she could marry anybody she wants. But if his clone is his brother, he effectively died childless. Now listen to this. Since he died childless, not only would the widow need Yibum, but the very one that would be able to do Yibum would be the baby, when he gets older, that emerged from her womb, because it's not her son. It is actually, it's not even related to him. He's related to the parents of his father. I mean, not his father, but the parents of the clonor. In other words, this issue of brother versus son is very significant. Or inheritance rights. If a man dies, leaving a son and a clone, do they divide the estate 50-50 because they're two sons? Or is the clone treated as a brother, and therefore all of the inheritance of the clonor will go to his son? But of course that would also mean when the clonor's father dies, his clone gets to split the inheritance with his clonor because they're both considered to be sons of that father. So this issue of are you a brother or are you a son, I think is a very real issue. Now, all the literature I have seen has simply blithely assumed that the relationship of a clonor to a clone is that of parent and child. I'm not sure that that's accurate. It seems to me that the brother, the sibling relationship, might actually be much more closer. Or, let me give you an example now in female cloning. Because just as the question is who's the father, we can raise the question of who is the mother. You know that already we have egg donation and surrogate motherhood. We already have those technologies. They've been used a long time. And one of the difficult halachic issues in these matters is who is considered to be the mother. Let's assume, for example, the egg donor is a non-Jewish woman, and the surrogate is a Jewish woman, or vice versa. We know that under the classical halachic rule of matrilineal descent, Jewish identity is determined not by the father, but Jewish identity is determined by the mother. The Reform movement has presently rejected that, but under classical halakha, Jewish religious affiliation is determined matrilineally and not patrilineally. The question is, who is the mother? Is a mother defined as the woman from whose body the baby was born? Or is the mother defined as the genetic egg source? Well, that's an unresolved issue, and in fact, la halacha, we actually say that the child needs a conversion either way. And that's something people need to know, because egg donation is fairly common, and people need to know that if the egg donation comes from a non-Jewish source, and we assume that it does in the United States, the child needs a conversion, even though the child is born from a Jewish mother, because of this uncertainty. Be it as it may, this is an old question and a well-known question. This is not a new question at all. I mean, it's new in the past 15 years, but this is well established. But cloning creates even more unusual possibilities. Because if in surrogacy there are only two candidates for motherhood, egg donor or gestational mother, in cloning there are four candidates for mother. Let me give you an example. Let us assume that DNA is taken from woman number 1. It is inserted in the egg of woman number 2, which is then transplanted to the womb of woman number 3. So, there are four candidates for mother. Is the mother the DNA contributor? Or is she a father? Can a mother be a father? But if we assume that women can only be mothers and not fathers, is the DNA contributor the mother? Is the egg donor the mother? Is the gestational woman the mother? Or, if I go with the sibling analogy, is it the mother of the DNA donor who's the mother? Because, in effect, this would be a sibling of the DNA donor. Now, granted, two of those four candidates will always be the same, meaning the mother of the DNA donor will be the same religion as the DNA donor. That's true. Either be Jewish or not. But the other candidates could be Jews or Goyim. And we need to know matrilineal descent. So these are sticky issues. I don't have an answer for them at all. But these are issues that need to be confronted. Just another 3 minutes and I'll finish. I just want to say that there are some aspects of cloning which, when we can do them, will be very, very welcome and very, very positive and will raise none of these particular issues. And that is, theoretically, cloning does not have to be limited to creating a human being. Cloning, right? Once you can reverse the DNA, the pre-programmed DNA, and reverse the cell differentiation process, you should be able to clone for specific organs. Clone a heart, clone a liver, clone a kidney. That would be wonderful, and because it's genetically compatible, it would not be rejected by the body. Now, even now, you could already begin to do that through stem cells. But that's a little complicated because what you do is you can clone, create an embryo, and then extract the stem cells, but that involves an early abortion. See, that involves a whole fertilized embryo that you then extract the stem cells from. But in theory, we're not there yet. In theory, there ought to be a way in which you could bypass the cell differentiation process without having to create the embryo. In other words, in theory, why can't I convert a fingernail into a heart if all the DNA is already there? Now, we're not there yet, but the day that we could bypass the creation of an embryo and avoid the abortion issues and use cloning technology for organ systems, that would be a wonderful way of avoiding organ shortages and a wonderful way of avoiding the issue of brain death controversies when you're still taking hearts out of people who might be alive on some level. And that would be a technology, I think, that is totally, totally welcome. As I say, we're not there yet. The closest we've come is to a really wonderful stem cell technology, but as I say, that does involve creating an embryo and then having to destroy it, which might get us into abortion issues. I should also say, too, that on the problem side of the ledger, all of the problems I've mentioned are plain vanilla cloning, where you're taking DNA from one source. Now remember, in theory, there's no reason why you can't mix and match sources, including animal and human DNA. And then the issues of who's the father, who's the mother, my son the horse, or whatever it is, are going to create tremendously difficult issues. We've already seen cross-species cloning in animals. There was some type of goat, I think, that was on the verge of extinction in Spain, and they actually put the DNA in the egg of another species and clones. If that ever happens with a human and animal, we would have some very, very difficult moral issues in terms of what is the status of that. So this lecture is really sketching the moral issues on the most simplest type of just cloning a human being. but the various forms this could take could be truly bizarre, very, very scary, and we need to be proactive in identifying these issues. Unfortunately, in the history of science, there is one axiom that is fairly clear. Whatever can be done will be done, meaning to say the scientific community, perhaps for good reasons, has not had a history of self-restraint. Now, by and large, that's good. By and large, that is the engine that fuels recovery. But when you have this lack of self-restraint and a lack of moral appreciation of the consequences of what you're doing, this could create the Brave New World nightmares that we desperately want to avoid. So it is important that we don't wait until these things happen and then start talking about them, because what usually happens then is you just figure out a way to justify whatever was done. Rather, as Paul Ramsey, a great Protestant theologian, wrote, that in a truly ethical society, you might agree ahead of time that certain things should not be done, even if that means that a certain modicum of scientific progress is going to be impeded. So thank you very much. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to take questions.